Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Ellen speaking. I'm here with Iheoma, and we're just going to give folks another minute to settle in, but we'll get started in just a second. All right, I see folks joining in. So just want to give a quick shout out. This is a co-hosted conversation between a bunch of colleagues in these different networks. Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, Grantmakers for Education, our colleagues there. Thanks so much for getting this set up and promoting and getting us all here together. We have participated in both of these groups and they're super valuable, and I just appreciate so much the community that is created in this space and now in this space together. So thank you. Shout outs to our colleagues there, and we will introduce ourselves. So I will go first. I'm Ellen Roche. I work at Trust for Learning. I'm our Chief Media and Philanthropy Officer, and I've been there just about 4 years. Really good to be here.
Hello, glad to be here. I am Iheoma Iruka, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm a research professor in public policy and also the founder and director of the Equity Research Action Coalition, along with being a board member with Trust for Learning. So very, very excited to be having this conversation with you, Ellen, and the rest of people who are joining us.
Awesome. So we're going to jump right in. I have like a few slides that I want to share as context, and then I have prepared a bunch of questions for Iheoma, because as I joked to Iheoma, like on our board meeting a few weeks ago, I scheduled this webinar very selfishly so that I could just pick your brain. But please, as we are going, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them in 30-ish minutes. In the meantime, feel free to put your name, your organization, your pronouns, your location, whatever you'd like to share in the chat. And feel free to just use the chat as we go along to react, share. We're going to have a few questions for everybody as we go. So I want to give us just a little bit of context. So Trust for Learning, we are a philanthropic partnership, and we work in these big 3-year cycles. So we are right on the cusp of our next 3-year cycle. And at the beginning of this 3 years, 2020 to 2022, we set a number of specific anti-racist or racial equity goals and metrics. And the point of that was to make our racial equity work explicit and to have benchmarks and to hold ourselves accountable. So I want to just use sort of a case study from that work as a jumping off point for this conversation. And again, partly selfishly, we are now in the process of setting our racial equity goals for the next 3 years. So this is part of our ongoing reflection and brainstorming and process for thinking about how to do that. So just to give you a little bit of context and sort of who the Trust is and what we do, if you know anything about the Trust, you know that we're all about ideal learning environments. So what does that mean? So over the years, we have had the privilege of working with a number of experts who sit on this sort of brain trust group that we convene and host called the Ideal Learning Roundtable. I'm sure many of these organizations and approaches will be familiar to you. It's a mix of sort of holistic early childhood approaches spanning prenatal to 8, serving kids in any setting, kids and families in any setting, plus sort of affiliated experts, researchers, policy folks. And over the years, they developed and continue to affirm these 9 key principles of early learning environments that are in plain language and that serve as our lens on really all of the work we do at the Trust. These will feel very familiar to anybody who's doing early childhood work. We want to support playful, exploratory learning environments that really build on everything we know about brain development and teaching and learning. But the first and foundational principle of this vision of quality, this framework for quality, is a commitment to equity. And by that, we mean racial equity, socioeconomic equity, linguistic and cultural equity, and ability equity. Today's conversation is primarily focused on racial equity, which is, for me, the primary lens that I'm trying to think about my own equity work and our equity work at the Trust. So these principles are sort of our lens. And the case study that I want to share with you as a jumping off point is one where I feel that we've done a reasonable job setting explicit racial equity targets and holding ourselves accountable to them. And I want to use this as sort of a jumping off point for how to think about racial equity work at more of a project level. So this is a report over on the left that we released a few weeks ago, and it synthesizes the work of 9 partners that we were able to support through this Seeding or Supporting Equitable Educator Development Fund. So the report is called Seeding Equitable Educator Development, and it sort of lays out the work and the incredible impact of these 9 partners. But the goal of this portfolio for the trust, so we're a philanthropic partnership, we work with funders around the country, and then we give grants and try to do that really holistically with partners and support them in various ways. What we were hoping for through this portfolio was to do one of 3 things, support our partners to do one of 3 things: reduce barriers to participation for educators of color. My radiator is going off. I don't know is that really loud, Iheoma? Oh, okay.
Nope, I don't hear anything.
Oh, good. There's like a hissing in the background. So support educators of color and educators facing socioeconomic challenges, which, as we know, is most early childhood educators, to participate in these really high quality models of educator development. So sort of the ideal learning approaches that we support. We also were hoping that we could support our partners to actually create new on-ramps to these high quality credential pathways. There was one project that started with a high school apprenticeship model. So strengthening those pathways in these really high quality models. And then the third bullet, which ended up being the one where the majority of the projects did a ton of work, is to incorporate anti-bias, anti-racist content and strategies into existing early childhood development programs. So just to share kind of quickly some of the impact and the racial equity considerations, we know that the seed fund, now that it's, the initial projects are all completed, that we were able to support our partners to have an impact at an individual level and a systemic level, which is, I think, something to think about for funders. Which level or levels can we, be thinking about? So we know that through scholarships, through some of those pathways that I mentioned, the seed funds were able to support more than 100 individual educators. And it really was amazing to hear those stories. So one of the questions, Iheoma, that we're thinking about, and I would love to hear you talk about even more, is this sort of balance of quantitative and qualitative, the storytelling side, the systemic side. How should we think about those things? How do we balance them? On the systemic side, the funds were also able to support revisions to large-scale educator development approaches, which we know moving forward will impact more than 40,000 educators a year. So on more of a systemic level, if we can support more of that anti-bias, anti-racist work at the adult curricular level, hopefully that has a systemic impact. So I won't go through all of these in detail, but I wonder, Iheoma, first, do you want to share any reflections just about your knowledge of kind of this seed work, other anti-bias work kind of in this area before we move on?
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I was part of a couple of them, more like an ad hoc consultations or a little bit. And to me, the fact that many of them did try to focus on how do we, not create something completely new, but to really integrate it, right? So the fact of, for example, you have credentials, how do we incorporate that into really the credentialing system that we have, right? So through CDA and the Council for Professional Recognition. And to me, those are really important to sort of embed it in than trying to create something new that will get flagged by, various entities. And I think to see some of this work happen, I think is important. But it also speaks to the idea that it's called seed fund. It means that it's a seed. And I think it's really important that for a seed to grow, you have to continue to nurture it. So, right. So I feel like these are just like they're beginning, budding, right? And so I think for me, I think it's important for funders and other sort of related entities to really continue to support the work of those who started it, to support the educators, right? Like, so if we already started them on the pathway to implement a high quality ideal learning program, and we need to make sure that we continue to till the ground to continue to have that, grow, more children could experience it, more families could experience it. So for me, that's the reflection I take, is that it's a seed. And for us to really see that full entire tree and the forest be what that is, we kind of have to fund it and invest in it. Like we think about early childhood. So that's how I look at this stuff. And I was privileged to be part of a couple of them, and they had a focus on credentialing, and one had a focus on an early learning network. And I think those are really part of how do we change the culture, the water, or AKA the system and the structures. So yeah. So good job, Trust for Learning. Good job, Ellen and team.
Yeah, and to build on that point, these are every single one of these projects, every single one of these partners did a ton of work, and it was work that they all wanted to do, but needed cash to actually like move it forward, as they were able to during the grant period. And that money is still needed for, phase 2, 3, 4, 5. And how do we, as a field, invest in this effort? It's not a one-time thing. So we, of course, are thinking about that ourselves, but and these were only the 9 projects that we could fund. We got, I think, at least 17 or 18 proposals. So we were only able to fund about half of the organizations who wanted to take on this kind of work. So yeah, I know we'll kind of touch on some of these same topics. So just actually to share a little bit more about who these partners were and shout out them and their incredible work, please take a look. We're continuing really to learn a lot from their efforts, and are so appreciative of the leadership and work that they took on. This grant started mid-2020 when we were all kind of like, well, hopefully COVID will be over soon. And just our partners have just done incredible work in this area. And many of them have stories and resources and templates to share. So please, anyone on this call, if we can facilitate any connections to these folks, don't hesitate to reach out. So shouting out our seed partners there, but I want to just peel back the curtain for a second on like, what were some of those racial equity considerations that we as the trust thought about before we launched the RFP? And this is not an exhaustive list, but we did, I think, in this project, we built on some, previous portfolios that we had brought sort of a racial equity perspective into. And just to reflect on this with you and Iheoma, kind of start this conversation of like, okay, how do we build on this? Where do we go from here? And there also might be things here that, weren't a good idea. We're not the best idea. But one of the things kind of starting at the top here that we're thinking about is how to continually shift power in philanthropy. So philanthropy comes with all of this sort of built-in power dynamic. And it's really, I don't think we actually can get rid of that. So how do we acknowledge it? How do we shift it? How do we think about it differently? And one of the ways that we attempted to do that kind of power shifting within the trust is that we invited external reviewers in to score all the grants. And we recruited them for their expertise. We sort of recruited based on expertise in a few different categories of skills. But we also set the goal that the majority of those reviewers would identify as people of color. And so that was one just sort of tactical way that we were trying to take some of the power out of our own hands and trust and compensate and honor the expertise of colleagues in the field to score and rank and help us make that decision about the grants. The rubric itself, which we made transparent through the grant process to the folks who were applying, was very heavily weighted toward racial equity. So, we've got this sort of whole rubric, and a number of the questions that the reviewers were scoring were related in various ways to racial equity. Some examples, and these are things I know many of us are doing, asking for more disaggregated data about demographics of educators. We asked about the leaders of the grant project. Within the portfolio, some of the power that the trust had was to say, we're going to set the goal that the majority of these grants would be led by leaders of color and serving either majority BIPOC and or majority low-income educators, depending on sort of the location of the grantee. We wanted to make sure at a minimum that the demographics of the educators mapped to the demographics of those educators in that community. And we also, again, this was kind of a small tactical thing, but because we had made it clear that we wanted to fund, a majority of projects that were led by leaders of color, we wanted to be cautious and, require as much transparency as we could around subcontracting to make sure that folks were brought in and compensated if like a partner of color may be brought into an organization that was white led, or, the project being led by a white person, that we were just doing our best to offset the possibility of tokenism or like uncompensated expertise. So this is just some of the things that we thought about in Iheoma. I would love to hear your reflections. Like, I think this is a start, but if we were to run another sort of process tomorrow, do you have kind of initial thoughts, reflections? What we might do?
Yes, I have so many thoughts on this one, and I won't bore everybody
No,
with it.
please.
But what I will say is, as you know, I said I'm a researcher at UNC and been a researcher, which means I always look for funding. I say that now, so not so you can give me funding right away, you should, but is that this means that I have been literally seeking funding, and there has not been a space that I've been in where, first of all, it was explicit about who the reviewers can be and the focus of who they want as a potential sort of grantee, right? Even though if we look at our whole entire grant that we've given, right, in this country, whether in early childhood and in any sort of sector, and who the reviewers are, they're likely to be majority white. The majority of grant recipients are likely to be white, right? And that's not often said, but that's in essence what happens. So to make this very explicit on the levels of the actual review process, which is really important, right? As somebody who studies work around, say, Black people and other people of color, and use sort of an anti-racist lens, there's a lot of people who review my grants that are like, I don't understand why this is important. What about the white comparison group? But we don't have racism. So when you don't have people who understand the context, the theory, the methods, the outcomes, they're likely to score your stuff low or just say it's not needed or not relevant. And so the fact that we're changing, or really you all are changing the process that says we're going to really give expertise to people of color. We're going to make it visible. Really, you're making visible what is invisible, which is often unsaid, which is that the reviewers are white, the grantees are white, but you're like, no, we're going to make it clear. And that to me is something that I would love for other philanthropic partners to really consider and think about, right? Even if you can't, because of various regs you may have in your own grant, even if you can say, want to make sure that our reviewers have either are experts in the given area, but in particular that you identify experts who are also Black, Indigenous, and have other sort of marginalized identities. To me, I think that it's really important to change in the way that money flows, right? And I also think that it's absolutely superb that you even had a target, right? To me, you can't advance racial equity. You can't change systems if we don't say we're going to try to change the power dynamics, change the opportunities by saying we're going to prioritize a group, a community that has been left behind, whether intentional or unintentional. So for me, I just think the process, it seems small, but I would say it's pretty major, right? And I think we can't take that for granted that you may think it's small, but this is huge, both on the process side, but also on the portfolio side. And I think I would just want to also just underscore that oftentimes we do know that a lot of tokenism happens. Shoot, I know I've been a token and, I'm just, it is what it is. But I think it's important that you're at least trying to say, if you're going to do it, at least make sure the money is right? Like they say, make sure the money is correct. And also make sure where possible, there's a level of accountability, right? So if you're going to have this particular partner subcontractor with you, we want to see how it's actually going to happen. We're going to actually want to find out how is this going to work out that doesn't just do that exactly tokenism. So for me, I think that all of you on the call, if you're a funder, that you really think about how could you incorporate this in a way that really is authentic, is meaningful. Even ask Ellen for the rubric that was used. And it's not just the demographics, but how did you go through this whole process to make sure that everybody was on the same page? To me, this is a powerful game changer if we can use it.
I appreciate and just want to underscore your emphasis on this idea of making the invisible visible, making the implicit explicit. And that I think is sort of one of these key racial equity principles, right? Because there's so much happening that we're not naming. Yep. And so even if we don't know how to fix it yet, naming it and then trying to name, what could an alternative be? Do you have other thoughts about, if we were to run a similar process tomorrow, like what other things could we consider? I have some ideas, but do you have other things that come to mind to like push ourselves,
Yeah, I would say the people who you funded, right? Or those who you did not fund, to say, you know, what could we have done differently to make it easier, right? Because the thing that I think, and we'll probably talk about this a little later, right? The thing about sort of funding, you know, BIPOC organizations is that they're doing a lot with a little. And they've been doing that for a long time. And being able to ask them, how was the sort of the whole process of trying to get a grant, right? Did it take you massive amount of time? Was it manageable? Is there ways we could have made it easier, right? So I think about one funder here in North Carolina whose process was literally 5 questions. I was like 5 questions. That means that anybody could literally go ahead and say, here's my answers to your 5 questions. That's pretty much like 3 sentences each, and call it a day, right? And even when they go through the grant review, process, or even the annual report, it's just as simple, right? So how can we make sure that we're not putting a burden on organizations that have never been given the resources that they needed? They've never been given the opportunity. So how do we make sure that the whole process of actually submitting a grant is as easy as can be, considering the lack of resources, considering probably the population that they serve? And so how do we make sure that even the process is as, I think, as humanizing as possible? And that it doesn't always have to be written, right? Are there other ways that you can kind of get information for a grant, right? Could it be something like a video could be shared, or maybe a story or portfolio, right? So we could think about other ways that we can begin to sort of leverage the way that other communities may communicate that's not always written, right? So that's a couple of things I think about. But I think asking the seed grantees, like, what could have been better? What are the areas that would make your work go further? Are there ways to improve it? And even the experts, right? Even asking the external experts, like, are there ways that we can improve how we can sort of reduce the power dynamics? Are there things that could be done better? So I think there's a lot of people who can give, I think, thoughts and advice to that.
Yeah, that's great. And we do anticipate continuing grant portfolios like this. And so each one, we sort of try to layer in more thought, and I think getting more feedback is a great idea as we look into sort of next year. I would love, to make this a little bit more participatory. We just shared this one example of kind of a project level, how do we think about racial equity? If there is something that comes to mind for you in your portfolio, especially in the last couple of years, if you have been trying to incorporate even more anti-racism into your work, would love to just see anyone share in the chat who'd like to share briefly. So yeah, how have people been incorporating racial equity considerations at kind of a project level? And we'll just keep an eye out in the chat for a few minutes. But I also want to give, and this is really where I'm personally trying to, push myself, continue to push the trust, to think even more deeply, not just sort of project by project, but how are we incorporating anti-racism into our whole model, our whole way of working, our whole way of thinking. So and I would love, any like feedback or, any other language that you think is really useful here. But I've started to use this language of racial equity being both a lens and an ongoing practice. So this, like, it's the way we think, we're looking through this racial equity lens, but it's also this like daily muscle or practice that we're trying to build. Do you have other like metaphors that you like, or how do you think about this?
I mean, I feel like, to me, racial equity is a lens, and it's actually also, like you're saying, a journey, right? I would say even for me, I'm literally still on the journey of really probably decolonizing my whole entire ways of being, that I literally have to think about literally every day, like, how am I doing it? Why am I doing this? So I think that, to me, a lens is really important to the work, right? When I think about the trust for learning, right? Like, ideal principle is kind of like the vehicle you're driving, but really but it's all couch under this racial equity lens, right? That means that we're going to always look to where's the power and privilege dynamics in this program, or even how we're doing our work, how we addressing, historical or contemporary inequities, how we addressing structures that harm or oppress, right? So to me, whether you call it a lens, whether you call it, but to me is that we're trying to sort of just switch the glasses, like really create this crystal lens to look through. And so I do love to use the word lens a lot of times, but I also want people to think of it really also as a journey, right? That you're not going to like, I'm not going to get it right. You're not going to get it right. You know, you're not going to get canceled either if you get it wrong. But the thing is that you have to at least try to put the glasses on, right? You know, because I think to me, that's what's most important, is that people try to put it on and then take it off, right? So I think it's to be careful that, you know, it's like we think about glasses. I wear glasses all the time, but I don't have it on now. I can take it off. And I think it's important to maybe think about, is there more of a permanence, something permanent that says you put it on and you keep it on, right? And it really is not just about the work or your gift giving or your philanthropy, but it's really also how you live your life, right? Because the more that it becomes almost like how you move and how you breathe, that's really the journey. And the journey is really about your full humanhood, your personhood, your spirit. It moves with you. So I feel like in some ways lens is a great one, but I want to think of it also as a journey, so that you realize that it's going to change and move. You may find yourself moving forward and then really going all the way back and then moving forward. But yes, I just saw somebody, I was Samantha Melvin. I love what she said, racial equity LASIK. Yes, that's a good one. Yes. I had LASIK, but you know, the problem with LASIK, mine went backwards because I had a kid. So, but something like that. I know, right? But it is but I do say it's definitely a journey and I hope we lean into it in reality, in the way that you think about it, the way that you engage with your colleagues, the way you actually engage with other funders. Because I think about it is that you fund the community, you guys have a whole language, a whole way of moving and doing. The question is whether you hold each other accountable, right? And that to me, I don't see happening quite a bit, but we'll continue. That will come up later.
I really appreciate that. And I think, yeah, like I'm white. And so a lens is something that I can put on, take off. And I really love the idea of like pushing, I don't like the word pushing, but like encouraging, nudging myself to embody, you know, have a more sort of embodied metaphor.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. This is good food for thought. And thanks everybody for sharing in the chat. For some reason, Iheoma, I can't see the chat right now. So feel free if you see stuff to shout it out.
Okay. Oh, while we're doing that, then let me just say quickly. So I know some people put in some questions in the chat. Do me a favor. Could you put it in the Q&A as well? Yes. And now, since you can't see the chat, I'll do better monitoring it. Okay, go ahead.
I just realized I couldn't see. So thank you.
Okay, that's okay. Nope, I got you now.
So just to share like a little bit more, and then I'm gonna launch into like my other questions for folks on the call. So the trust, we are structured as this philanthropic partnership. As I mentioned, we work in these 3-year cycles, and we try to support ideal learning environments in any setting that's publicly funded, prenatal to 8. And I just want to share kind of where we have landed as we look to the next 3 years. And you know, as we've talked about, 3 years ago, when we kind of started this cycle, we knew that we wanted racial equity to be a part of everything we were doing, but we ended up there were many things that we set racial equity goals on and, you know, held ourselves accountable to, reported to our board on, but it was more sort of project by project, right? So for like this grant portfolio, we had these racial equity considerations. For this effort, for this report, you know, we would have different racial equity considerations, and we still will moving forward. But we are trying to like even more fully have, you know, the principles of ideal learning and racial equity and inclusion be like our outer boundaries. This is, you know, we only do things sort of within these two kind of key values. And just to give you all a little bit more of kind of the way we're thinking about our work moving forward. So this is kind of our new theory of change graphic. Kids, families, educators are, you know, playing in the middle. And we really want to hold ourselves accountable to impact at these 2 levels, the learning environment, the policy environment. Bronfenbrenner fans out there might have a little glimpse of recognition in terms of this kind of ecological model of child development. And the place where we've seen our work be the most effective is when we can do these 3 things in tandem. So we make direct investments, we are a grant maker, but we are finding that if we make just a single direct investment and it's sort of a one-off, like here's some money, you know, we hope everything goes well, good luck, we're here to support you. It's not nearly as effective as when we can make investments and then bring our partners together to engage in convening or movement building at various levels. The Ideal Learning Roundtable is part of that. We have an amazing network of more than 40 Head Start providers, all doing different ideal learning approaches around the country in Head Start. And then finally, this thought leadership piece, which is the part that I lead through media and communications work with my colleague, Toby. And that is really about that amplification, usually not of the trust ourselves, but of our partners, our grantees, our board members, and just trying to get, tools out there and stories out there, sort of in the broader landscape. So this is, where we're trying to go. And the questions that I have for you, Iheoma, are really part of this ongoing deliberation and reflection to set our goals for the next few years. So just again, I'm curious to hear in the chat, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get into a few more questions. For folks who would like, how is it going in terms of incorporating racial equity into your entire organization or mission? And that probably looks really different for each of us, but would love to just hear. I'm sure many of us have either been doing this since before 2020 as we have, or maybe ramped up efforts in the last couple of years. But what has that looked like? I'm curious to just see.
Hey, Ellen, there was actually, before you even asked this question, Katie, one of the last chat that came in, she just mentioned, and Katie mentioned, their team has been doing internal work. They're at different places on their journey, but they're taking time for discussions and group learning exercises during weekly meetings. So that was one that was really important. There was a couple of, and sorry, I can't read everybody's chat, but there was a couple that came in that really talked about sort of how to make sure that part of it is make sure the community is sort of engaged first and foremost. You're creating it for them, by them, in many ways. So, okay.
That's amazing. And actually, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen because for whatever reason, I can't see the Q&A, and just check the Q&A real quick and see if there's anything we want to take.
Yes, there were 3 Q&As. Yes, there were 3 that came in. Yes. Can you see them, or should I?
I can now.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, let's just do a few now, and then I have a few more for you, that I planned, but I want to respond to some of these. So I see one from Julie. Hi, Julie. Asking if we can share more about who created the rubric. Was it the trust, or was it also in partnership with the external reviewers? So the rubric actually has evolved over multiple grant RFPs. So we've now given 4, or we've sort of conducted 4 large scale, either invited or open RFP processes since 2018 or 2019. And we've had a rubric every time, and it's evolved more and more toward racial equity each time. So the trust has been the kind of keeper and facilitator of that. But my colleague, Chris Ann, who has led each of those processes the last couple of times for sure, and possibly the ones before that, she has solicited feedback on the rubric itself, both from our partner, like our reviewers, but also usually from a couple of external experts in that area. So it's sort of facilitated and owned by us, but we have tried to get some feedback on it. So Kathleen is asking, I would love, Iheoma, if you want to start with this one, what are your thoughts on strategies to manage up to advance the racial equity agenda within orgs? This is definitely a question that I'm very curious about. Within organizations where the trustees or leadership may not be moving quite as quickly as the program officers or staff.
This is, I like this question, and actually, there was another one that I saw in the chat, and so it's funny. This is a question that I had. Somebody asked me this morning. Right, they're running a huge sort of program, and a statewide program that's supposed to actually address racial disparity in sort of healthcare access, et cetera, which is huge, right? Medicaid dollars, all these millions of dollars flowing in. And this person was like, so how do we talk to people and figure this out? Especially your leadership side. So to me, this is really important. My first question to them was, so tell me exactly, this program, literally the idea is to actually address racial disparities, like specifically address racism that creates racial disparities. So to me, if that is the focus at some level is to address disparities on different levels, racial, economic, et cetera, to me, the question now becomes, so how do we do that without talking about the elephant in the room, right? So to me, I think it's to ask people, so if the issue, if many of our challenges, quote unquote, is that, children of color, Black children, Latino children, et cetera, or children with disabilities and children with different marginalized identities, if they're not having the best opportunities in life, how do we get there, right? What is our theory to get there, right? How do we think we're going to get there just by like not talking about it? So for me, it's actually asking the leadership in the room to say, let's kind of step back and have this conversation, because we're all committed to having major impact, right? We want to see big impact in our community, in our state, at whatever levels. So I say start with the big game, the big thing you want, and then let's have a conversation about how do we get there. So here's what we're doing. Here's what we want to get to. So now walk me from what we're doing to how we get there. And I think the more you can have those very clear conversations that goes from A to Z, that's where you can begin to say, well, if we did this, how does this actually address the fact of, say, Latino children not able to access subsidy for various reasons? Like, so to me, I think that we have to really have people begin to do the thinking. The problem is that we try to force feed it so quickly. And I think it doesn't help, because if you force feed somebody something, they don't know how to sort of like go explore it. They don't know how to become inquisitive. So I would say, try to do that. The other thing I think this has helped a lot of people is that if you can force people to go to a racial equity institute, not like the 2-hour one that they have, you need to go to a real racial equity institute. They don't pay me. I don't have any affiliations or relationship, but those sort of like multi-day racial equity institutes, to me, are so powerful, not because you get to hug and kiss and do all that. It's because they literally begin to tell you and show people how racism literally is structured in our systems, in our policies, in the way we give money, either at the federal level, the state level, the way that we are gatekeepers. Funders, you are a gatekeeper, right? So it begins for you to understand your roles. So to me, I would say part of it is to, begin to have the conversation about what's our impact, what are we doing? And then I would actually say that all of you, everybody, even those who are the experts in racial equity or diversity, equity, inclusion, everybody goes and sits through that 3-day session, at least as a first step. So they begin to understand that it's not about sort of the interpersonal issues. People think about discrimination like, oh, the N-word or somebody didn't get hired. Yeah, those matter. But I think we have to understand that there's a lot of baked in racism in funding and many other things. And the more that they can see how it's so structured and from a historical and contemporary lens, then I think you can begin to not say, okay, now what could we do? But I think you really need information first, at least in my viewpoint. You need information, and hopefully the information will eventually begin to change some behaviors, some actions, and then create that policy change. But I say first start with their thinking. Just understand where they're coming from, and then I would say go through sort of the different Racial Equity Institute, the book reading, watch a video, watch a movie. So there's many things that you can do. You can hire DI consultant, but I'm one for, you can try to hire that out. You can, but the work still has to happen inside. Like, you can say, hey, come help us, but you have to still do the work. You can't go around the work. You can't try to do a sideways shuffle from it. You have to go through the work. And until we do that in an honest way, I think we're going to continue to sort of perform. And a lot of us are performing. I mean, it is what it is. But if you can go through it and really go through that struggle, I think that we can see some changes in that.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. And I think this point that you raise about performing racial equity is so important to think about in those moments. And I think especially for white people, like, when are we sort of performing racial equity or saying all the right words? And when are we kind of forcing ourselves to be uncomfortable and struggle through things and not have any answers often and feel anxious and, all those things. And that, yeah, I think that's like a really important sort of filter to be looking for. When am I just saying all the right words versus when am I making like when am I having a hard conversation?
And trust, a lot of us know it. The thing is that the sad part, at least I would say those of us in certain spaces, we're like, we know it. We can see the performance, because all we have to do is look at your actual actions, right? Because in the end of it, you can do a lot of like nice words, say the right things. But if I see who you're hiring or not hiring, if I see where your funding is going or not going, if I see sort of the kind of groups that you're surrounding yourself with or not. So to me, eventually, it doesn't matter what the words are. It's really about what your behaviors indicate. And we can only, most of us say, I can only believe what you do, not just what you say. And I think, again, nobody's perfect. And this is including myself, right? So I think we have to also understand that people make mistakes, and you want people to kind of, be able to say, you know what, I didn't like that. That's the decision you made. You could have done a better decision, all that. But it's also important for people to do their own internal work to begin to examine some of their decision making, especially when they have a level of power. And I would say that funders, no matter how big or small you are a gatekeeper, you are a power broker. And if you don't know how your your power broker sort of, if you don't know how your power sort of communicates, then I think it's important that you really go deeper and dig into, like, how do I use my power in ways that really creates opportunities, that really dismantles system of oppression in wherever space I'm in. If you don't do that, then to me, you're probably just as dangerous as the next person, to unfortunately to say that.
Mhm. And I think sometimes, I'm on staff at Trust for Learning, and we work with incredible funders, all of whom are really committed to anti-racist work. And that is a huge privilege that that's who our board and our funders are, because I don't have to fight upstream. But I think sometimes when we do, it's sort of, we can get into sort of a mindset of like, I feel like I don't have any power. But then when I think like grand scheme of things, like I work in philanthropy, my proximity to power and money is like so privileged and rarefied, and like whatever I can do in this position, and I don't always know what the right thing to do is, but yeah, the proximity to a lot of capital that can, that can change systems, that can help support people. I try to remind myself that actually it's like extremely privileged and rarefied to be this proximate. So we have other great questions, and I'm seeing some in the chat as well. So if you did put a question in the chat, just to make sure we see it, please put it in the Q&A as well. One question from Rosalind. So Marina mentioned a government initiative in Connecticut where there was sort of a change from an existing BIPOC model to a white organization, and then asked, do we try to address government policy? So short answer, just in terms of like the trust work, we definitely try to support policy that is more anti-racist, more equitable, and more aligned with the principles of ideal learning environments. And I'm wondering, Iheoma, just because you're nodding, do you want to speak to the specific Connecticut story? I'm guessing I know exactly who Marina is, but just because I didn't see it in the chat. But if not, Marina, feel free to share more in the chat if you haven't already.
Yeah. Marina did share that in the chat. I want to find it. Actually, I want to find it. It's
awesome.
I know I read it earlier. Sorry, here it is. Okay, here we go. So earlier she said, Marina said, "Hey, Marina, glad you're here." She says there was something we're talking about that she says resonates with her deeply. In the state of Connecticut, the state started a staffed family childcare initiative after All Our Kin, work they've been doing over 2 decades. Recently, they put out an RFP for organizations to apply to be a CFCCN, like what would you call that? Like a sort of a statewide family childcare network sort of thing. And it was awarded to an organization that's predominantly white led. And they were not explicit about their RFP rubric process, nor were family childcare educators engaged in the review. And today, as it stands, the family childcare community is asking questions. And so to me, I think, so this is an example of where if we don't interrogate a lot of the systems, like, so if you're in state government, that, they have to do an RFP. Sometimes they even ask you for feedback, et cetera. And if you don't ask them, how did you make your decision? They can say, well, we picked the best organization that applied. And so a thing like a rubric, and that's why I think somebody earlier asked, could we get a copy of the rubric, right? If you don't know what they're making a judgment by, they could be making a judgment based on, has this organization been in Connecticut for 50 years? Right. And so they're gonna be like, well, only you pass, you don't. So to me, these are things that we have to challenge, right? So to this situation, I would say that this is where there needs to be a level of mobilization to make it very clear that any future RFPs that go out, whether for early care education or anything else, must explicitly incorporate equity, right? XYZ, right? Yes, Connecticut could be an all-white, majority white state, but I think you have to demand that they incorporate that. They probably have a diversity office of some sort. Every state practically has one now. And so you can say, how much are you incorporating the principles of equity, not just in the program side, but in all facets, including who's reviewing, the rubric being used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many ways that equity could be incorporated, and then money flows through that way too. So I think this is a classic example. I'm glad that you shared that with us, that if we don't pay attention to some of these things, money flows into communities or at least is given to those who may not actually be part of the community, and then we lose out, right? So I think that's a really classic example, but I think the more that we can really hold our policymakers and leaders accountable. See, that's the thing about it. It's not about being a mean person, is that if you're a member of a community, you want people to hold you accountable, right? And so part of it is that if you're going to champion equity, and I want to provide equitable experiences and outcomes and all these various things, you have to say, well, this one, we question that. They could be the right, they could be the right partner, I don't know, but you could question, how did you get here? What were your questions like? How can we ensure that there was at least a diversity of applicants, et cetera, et cetera? So to me, this is one of those things where you can mobilize and actually write and ask questions and change the system in some ways. Let's change the process.
Yeah, and I was able to catch up on the chat a little bit, and again, just shouting out Marina and your amazingness, Marina Rodriguez from Allerkin, and your amazing work in Connecticut as an organizer and as someone who like speaks truth to power so beautifully on like a daily basis. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so Iheoma, I have some questions written down, and I want to see which ones we like haven't touched on. I want to ask you a few of them, and I really want to encourage people, put your questions in the Q&A. Very happy to share the rubric. Just saw that come through. Please email me because I don't actually have it handy. It's not like a publicly shareable link, but I'm just going to put my my email address in the chat there. Just shoot me an email to remind me, and I'm happy to share the rubric with anybody who's interested. So I'm just looking at kind of my questions here and what to prioritize with the time that we have left. So, well, okay, one thing that we've kind of touched on and I want to go deeper on is, you know, related to shifting power, related to, quoting you back to yourself, you know, when we were both on the ECFC's racial equity committee a couple of years ago at a meeting, you know, we were brainstorming as we often do. I know ECFC colleagues are on the call, and, you know, we were just sort of like tossing out all the ideas. And I remember you said, I love all these ideas. These are great ideas, but in the end, like, show me the money, right? Like, is money change, is the path of how money is flowing changing in some way? Who is this money going to? How are we tracking it? And, you know, you've echoed that today, and I just appreciate that so much. And I want to, flag, and we're going to share this at the end and make sure everybody has the link, the National Black Child Agenda, which you, of course, have been working on and amplifying and getting out to the field. And just want to appreciate and name that you all really codified saying we need to think about reparations in thinking about early childhood and supporting Black children and families. And so, you know, this is my first job in philanthropy. I've been a teacher, worked at nonprofits, worked at small businesses, but as I'm getting to know the philanthropic space and seeing people trying to move in this direction, you know, a lot of us are talking about like trust-based philanthropy and sort of how do we move into this different way of engaging. And I'm curious about, you know, like reparations philanthropy. What would that look like? What would a reparations mindset? How might that change our thinking? How might that change our practices? So I would love to just hear more about how that's informing your thinking, and then like what we can take as funders.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that question forward, Ellen. I want to make sure people understand that reparations, right? You know, people hear it, there's a physiological reaction, like, oh my God, no, we are so beyond that. But I would say that, you know, if you take the root word of reparations, it's actually repair, right? It means that we repair and acknowledge that something has been done wrong and we have to fix it, right? And that includes a public denouncement or announcement that we did something wrong. We extracted wealth from a group of people in the most dehumanizing way in the past, but also currently, right? So reparations is that one part of that is repair. But of course, the other way is literally economics, right? In the end of it, Black people specifically, if you actually look at the US Census data that they pushed out earlier this year, the 2019 wealth for basically the median wealth for Black people is about $19,000. For white people, it's closer to $190,000, right? That's median wealth. And we have to recognize that just the money part, like I can say other things. And so to me, we could do a lot of equal giving, right? You could say, let me look at my portfolio. Oh, look, I gave, 25%, I gave, 50% to white-led organization, I get 50% to BIPOC, and it's good. But that's one level. The question I probably ask is, so when we look at the dollars, was it proportional? So did you say I gave 50% of the total dollars I had to give to white-led organization, 50% of the total dollars to BIPOC organizations? Again, recognizing that people of color really are the majority and have been doing the work for free for a long time, and probably do a lot of the human rights and civil rights work on without any announcement, without any shingles or any sort of thing. They just do it for free because their lives literally depend on it. And so when I think about the issue of sort of reparations, I think with philanthropy, we have to think thoughtfully about how do we make sure, as we're trying to do this sort of advance of racial equity and engage in anti-racism, that we have to actually address the historical part, right? So if you know that you want to commit to, for those, and there was a group that committed to Black Lives Matter and given to BIPOC-led organizations, particularly Black-led organizations, I would ask, has that happened, right? So for me, it's like, you go look in your books, have you given to Black-led organizations? How much have you given, right? So here's one quick example. One of my community partners said, we got money from a funder. Usually we ask for like $20,000. And they were like, you know what, this time we're going to ask for what we really need, which is really more like $100,000. Right. And they're like, OMG, we totally got it. And we got a little bit more. Because if you remember, a lot of Black and BIPOC organizations, and I'm using BIPOC as short term, but I tend to not to use it a lot, to be honest. But we realize that a lot of them don't ask for a lot of money. They literally, even if it costs $100,000, they'll ask for 15. And so I think part of reparations is not just the economic part, but it's also realizing that a lot of organizations led by Black and brown people, we've been conditioned to ask for the least amount just so you can get something, because you don't get anything. And so I think that's one piece that we have to think through, is how do we make sure that we're really repairing it and giving equitable, which means that we're giving way more. Not the same, not even proportional, like you're giving way more because you understand that they are starting so far behind. If the Black and brown communities literally have no wealth, they have no wealth and they have no money. When you don't have those two things, somewhere along the line, they have to have, the resources have to come from somewhere. And I'm not saying it has to all come from philanthropy, but it sure is a good start if you're able to say, you know what, I recognize that we have not funded you, Black organization, at the same level as we have actually funded white-led organizations. We've held you to the same standards. We've literally said you must submit the same paperwork, you must go through the same review, but we've literally given you disproportionate amount of money for decades. Do we say, you know what, because we realize that, we're going to make up for it? Who is committed to making up for those historical, because we tend to do the sort of like what I call the speed bump. I'm going to make up for it. I'm going to do better this year. But we actually have not made up for what happened 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. If we don't do some of that reparations, that repairing, then I feel like a lot of it is really, in the end of it, is really like you're doing okay work, but you're not doing anti-racist work. And that means that we have to actually do work that says we're going to literally commit to giving back and repairing the damage of what we've extracted a lot of things. And then we can move forward in that. And I think that requires, and I know for many people, trying to get through your board and convince them may take work and time. But I think it's for you to look at your historical giving and say, who have you given money to? When you realize how much money you've given to certain groups and communities, and say, okay, now if we did that 30 years ago, let's put an interest rate on it, right? That means that if you compound that, that's actually way more. So I say, I'm a statistician. Let's do math. If nothing else, don't put emotions in it. Do some math, and you realize the money you have not given to communities, you need to compound that. And then as you move forward, that's really the reparations that you're giving back. You're not doing them a favor. So I wanted to understand reparations. You're not doing me a favor when you've extracted over time, you've kind of built all your wealth, you've gotten a whole, steps ahead. Literally, reparations is about making repair and getting us closer to the same footing. Is not a freebie, is not a welfare check, is just making reparations.
Yeah, thank you. And I am I'm listening and connecting to, the question that Rosalind asked and Vance kind of double clicked on, or sorry, not Rosalind, Kathleen asked, and Vance kind of re-upped around that managing up piece. And, we're all sort of in different positions with different power. But to your point earlier about, it's not a 1 hour Zoom workshop on racial equity that's going to really change someone's mind or help them have those like aha moments. Now I'm thinking sort of through the, developmental perspective, how do we help people, especially white people who do not acknowledge, or maybe were never taught, hopefully at this point, more and more white people are being taught the history and the facts and the economic facts, and frame it as exploitation and extraction that must be repaired ethically, morally, and help people go on that journey as learners, because we have not been taught, right? And of course, we want to start at the beginning and teach people differently moving forward, but I think that really speaks to your point that you can't necessarily sort of overwhelm people with all the buzzwords right away and expect them to change, right? So how do we do this in an ongoing way? How do we support that development, especially for people who are controlling a lot of wealth and a lot of capital that could be deployed differently and be reparative?
So can I say something real quick to that?
Yeah.
And I really remember, I have a whole framework about how do you begin. One of them is to sort of look at the history, right? And so I would say, look at the history of your own philanthropic organization. Where did the money come from, right? So, the actual original source of it. And, I'm not a oracle, that's not what I am, but I say, look at the history of both the money, where the main source came from, and see, is there a history that needs to be uncovered on one end? But also look at the history of the tax code, right? I mean, philanthropy, the idea is that, of course, you're giving out of good intentions, but let's also understand it's an economic gain, that you kind of have to give the money away or you're taxed, right? You actually get even a better benefit by giving money away. So I think that we also have to look at, and who gets to do that? If you're low income and poor, you don't get to give money away and benefit, threefold out of it. That's not how this works. So I think we also have to just look at even the economics of philanthropy, right? I think the more we can, and then think about how is it that we get to do that? Can somebody who maybe makes $24,000 a year, could they do the economics? Probably not, right? So I think we have to continue to see, again, it doesn't mean you change, well, you could change it. It doesn't mean you change it, but it does help you to see that there are policies that have been set up that's only available to certain people and or certain organizations. And the more that you're aware of it, the more that you can say, you know what, I may not be able to change this part right away, but I probably know how I can help other organizations take advantage of some things that may be available. So again, this may be way outfield for us to talk about tax policies, and we don't have to do that. But I think we have to begin to go deeper, both about the history of where the source of your foundation funds come from, right? Who started it and under what condition, et cetera. Again, I'm not going to go back and castigate it, but I think it will help us to say, you know what, if part of it came from the extraction of certain communities or the taking of land, et cetera, you want to know that. And then you want to say, you know what, we gotta make that visible, and we gotta make some repair and correction to that, right? It's actually okay to say, you know what, they happen. Let's come up front, let's talk about it, and let's say, you know what, let's make that better. And I think, to me, that actually helps. You may not give the money all the way, but you may say, you know what, it helps when somebody acknowledges the pain. And that's what I think a lot of times that America does not acknowledge specifically the pain and the harm is done to Black people, specifically Black communities. So to me, there is this pernicious nature of anti-Blackness in philanthropy. People love people of color, communities of color, organizations of color writ large. But when I would say, personally, from my vantage point, when it comes to Black-led organizations, I would charge us to say, is there a level of anti-Blackness that exists? And is there more that we can do to make sure that as we think collectively from the different communities of color, that we actually begin to hone in on that there's a level of anti-Blackness that seems to exist where people do not trust Black-led organizations with a lot of funds. I think one of Rachel's questions or somebody's question must have been like, how do we make sure that people trust that BIPOC or Black-led organizations would amount like a lot of money. That has not happened. Even big centers that are being set up right now, very few are given to Black people, very few are given to people of color, right? And that tells us that even in the journey of equity, that big massive amount of money is not actually given to people of color. You can do the work, but we're not going to give you the money. And that tells us something about how you still see us. And that to me is very sad, but it is, but it is what it is right now.
Yeah, and I'm noticing also Kiami's comment in the chat around philanthropy addressing complicity and participation in racist, white supremacist policies, systems, et cetera. And I think again, to your point around, this is not like one-time work, right? And the effort that certainly we're trying to make in terms of actually going deeper, holding ourselves more accountable at the trust, that we're not just acknowledging it once, that this is continually acknowledged. I am noticing that it's 5. We have time to go till 5:15, but I want to make sure we plug our resources real quick, just in case people have to jump. So I'm just going to find my, most importantly, just in case anybody has to run, Iheoma has a new book coming out and it's available for pre-order. And on our board meeting, I was like, joking to myself, like, Iheoma probably has a new book coming out. And then she actually does, because Iheoma, I don't know how you do it, but you are like the most incredibly prolific, brilliant thinker person working. And so I want to make sure everybody sees this before they have to jump if they need to. So I'm trying to vamp while I share my screen here. Okay, I think you can see my screen, and I just want to make sure that everybody pre-orders this, because Iheoma, your last book was a huge resource to me. I'm sure to many folks on this call. It came out a couple of years ago, so looking forward to this. When is it actually coming out?
Should be coming out June 2023. Thank you. I know. Thank you. I know. When Ellen asked me, I was like, oh, I forgot the book. Yeah, we should. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, and of course, this, the work I do is often with many people. And I'm so thrilled and fortunate to be part of, a great, community of people who love to both write but also do work. And so, yeah, definitely feel free to check out our new book coming out by Teachers College Press, and We Are the Change We Seek. Right. So to me, we try to look everywhere else, right? Go find that shiny object, this consultant here, this big speaker here, whatever. In the end of it, the book is calling attention to, like, there are things that we can do in early childhood right now ourselves, whether our education leaders and warriors, whether it's sort of our assessments, right? There are things that we can do if we're trying to advance racial justice. And so it's really a guide to practice and practitioners. But you'll see where I talk a bit about history, of course, which is always important, and also about what can we do today to continue to advance racial equity, and especially anti-racist work. So yeah, I hope you all check it out and share with your communities, and when it comes out in the summer of 2023. Thank you, Ellen.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll be on webinars once it comes out, after we've read it, asking you more questions about everything in it. And Iheoma, I copied the chat to this and I lost it somewhere. Would you mind just dropping the chat into the link to to pre-ordering the book into the chat, so people have it, if you have it?
Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. Let me find it. I know you think I would have it right handy. Let me go find it.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
So just since we're taking a little turn to make sure we're kind of plugging resources in case people have to leave at the top of the hour, I want to get back to a couple more questions, but I did want to just shout out some of these resources. So in addition to the new book, I think my co-director at the Trust, Tasha, is going to share some of these links in the chat. We mentioned the National Black Child Agenda, the 14 priorities, Start with Equity from Children's Equity Project. And I also wanted to plug this brief that we supported over the last year. It came out maybe 6 months ago with a number of partners about preschool integration and preventing segregation in pre-K. But Iheoma, do you want to say anything else about the National Black Child Agenda or the 14 priorities?
Sure. I mean, I would just say, for sure. Thank you so much, Tasha, for plugging it in. I want y'all to look at it, just because, while it's called the Black Child National Agenda, really the policies that we're flagging are things that we know is happening, and it benefits not just Black children and families, but really all children and families. So definitely check it out. You'll see more coming out really around, is there progress on the Black Child Agenda in different states. And then, of course, we'll start with equity priorities led by Chantal Meek again, the Children's Equity Project. I was part of that. And really, we're continuing to see the movement of trying to help states and local governments to really think about how do you operationalize equity, particularly around early child education. So from doing academies to small state work to one-on-one. Again, you know, and there's also a template that really goes with this report that helps you really begin to take each of the policies and really work it through. Think about what are the strategies, where's the data, where's the funding, who should be at the table. So again, you know, and that's why I say in the end of it, this work is not a one woman, one man, one person show. It really requires a lot of really partnership and work across many sectors. And so we definitely want you to check that out and check out the others that Tasha put in. Thank you so much.
So we pulled in also just 2 resources on the research side. And Iheoma, I just happened to see your new article that just came out, The Effects of Racism on Child Development. And I like skimmed it yesterday or whenever I saw it. And I was like, oh, perfect timing. And then the evidence brief that the Trust put together with a bunch of our colleagues, and probably including some people who are on the call, really synthesizing the development research, the neuroscience research, the anti-racism research, the inclusion of multilingual learner research, the inclusion of kids with disabilities and special needs research, all through this lens of the principles. So that is one resource I want to make sure people have. But do you want to speak a little bit to this new paper?
Yes,
Yeah.
I know, I know. See, I know these things drop so quickly. I can't even share or get to it. But I did put in the chat a link. You should be able to get access to it. There's not a paywall for this one at all. So I just put the link in there. But I'm really excited about this particular paper. Again, amazing co-authors there. And I want to flag what we call the RISE. It's called the RISE framework. And really the idea of this paper is to make sure that we are clear about what is racism, right? Like, it's like, we don't want to guess. I don't want anybody to guess what it is. And we talk about the different forms of it, but also we talk about the assets, right? When people talk about strength-based and all that, like we talk about what are the cultural assets that you can look at, whether it's language, family, aspirations, spiritual. So we really try to be very clear. And then finally, we really try to sort of at least give to like, what are some potential policies we can focus on to really advance sort of inequities, structural inequities for young children. And so I hope at least you check out the visual, which is beautiful because, you know, I love visual stuff. But I do hope you check it out in particular, just for the definition of what the different forms of racism. And because in the end of it, I think the policies we have at the end are kind of like the beginning. To me, we need to go even further. So I do hope you look at it, share the link that I gave you. You can share that out. It's an e-link, so it's unlimited access to it. But let me know if you have any issues about it. But no, thank you for flagging that. I know that just came out, I think, this week.
Yeah, I'm excited to read it more deeply and absorb it. And I think, you know, as you know, and probably folks on the call know, I have just decided to start my PhD this semester. I was telling you, I'm like volunteering after the webinar, and then I need to finish writing my final paper for one of my classes, which is all amazing. But, you know, being back in sort of the research world, and I'm in a neuroscience department, I mean, people are just starting to figure out, like, how do we like think about and talk about racism from a science perspective. And you and other colleagues are just the vanguard on saying, like, we have to think about this deeply and systemically and scientifically. So it's so needed. And I just appreciate having the resource, you know, and being able to like learn myself from it, but being able to point people to it. So those are a couple things on the research front. Just to make sure, the report I mentioned earlier, Seeding Equitable Educator Development, Iheoma's last book with her co-authors that I think got cut off in the screenshot there. And then the Principles of Ideal Learning Environments, if you're interested in more info on that, I think Tasha will share those in the chat. So unless Iheoma, you want to plug anything else on the fly, we can go back to a few more questions before we wrap up. But yeah.
No, I'm done. No more plugs. I'm sorry.
No. So yeah, let's see what else is in the Q&A. And please, if you have not already asked a question, but you would like to, please do. So I'm just skimming the chat as well.
Well, Rachel has a question, the Q&A. Was that one from Rachel Schumacher? Did we answer that one? There was a Q&A.
Oh yeah, so I think you answered this a little bit, but so Rachel had asked, and hi Rachel, this sort of bias against small groups handling big grants. And I think that, Iheoma, you touched on it a little bit, but there are these sort of multiple components to it. And you, I think, started to talk about like the mindset of funders who might just be unwilling or not see the value of small organizations or Black-led organizations specifically, and need to like do their own work to change their mindset about giving large unrestricted grants to small organizations, Black-led organizations. And I would like to hear you talk more about that and sort of respond more to Rachel's question if you would like. But one of the things that, come up in like our racial equity conversations in ECFC at the Trust is that there are some sort of meaningful barriers sometimes to being able to give a large and unrestricted grant easily to a small organization. We are a fiscally sponsored philanthropic partnership, and our fiscal sponsor, which provides a lot of great infrastructure, also provides a lot of infrastructure. And so we don't always have that flexibility. I'm sure other funders don't as well. So part of that is, how are we pushing on those rules, right? To, Sherry Killens, who did work with ECFC and still is doing work with ECFC on this. I think in our group, she really was surfacing like, well, okay, what if those rules could we change, right? Like, how are we pushing on the rules that do exist? But both sort of tactically and more conceptually, is there more you want to share about this bias, which just it becomes self-perpetuating, right?
That's literally what it does, right? And so my answer to, at least part of my response to that, Rachel, I think that's a really great question, is that, like, yes, it makes sense, right? Like, you don't want to give somebody who doesn't have the full capacity like all this money, because they may be like, oh my goodness, I don't know how to actually get it out the door, which may be part of the thing. So I think that's important. So I think if there's some of those, is that maybe at least you could always address their bias, but it's maybe continue to build capacity, right? So if you're going to really invest in organizations that have been underfunded or underinvested in for a long time, let's think about how do we continue to build the network, right? Continue to build their capacity. And that may mean that we create different kinds of networks. So for example, I think, Rachel, weren't you part of the Raisin, what was that? I think there was the child care Raisin the Fund or something like that. But like, we can actually create networks where you can actually give funds, but you give funds, to multiple groups so you can work together. So I just think we have to just challenge. You may not, because you can't really reduce bias. To be blunt about it, bias is a human condition. Like, it's just part of how we kind of know. But what we could do is probably reduce the way that we may institute some of our behaviors. And so some of that could be, let's continue to make sure that if you're going to fund a white-led organizations, let's kind of say, we need you to make sure that you're really engaging in community-rooted collaboration with other, communities of color in deep, meaningful, authentic ways. Create networks, right? Instead of like, instead of giving big money to one. So you know what, we want to divvy it up in some way. Somebody could be the fiscal agent, but it's really money that is controlled by the coalition, or however you term the networks. So I think we just have to be much more mindful that if we're going to, use certain reasons, which on the face makes sense, but then you're not doing something to actually address the issue of like, yeah, they're smaller, they don't have capacity, then let's fix the capacity. So then come 2 years from now, that won't be an excuse, right? So if there's a current problem right now, you can't address the policy, but you could address the capacity building, you could address the connections that people have. So like, for example, I think of a really good funder for the Equity Research Action Coalition. And I love that what she always does is think about who can I connect you with? How can I make sure our dollars that we're given stretch further? How do we continue to build your capacity, your networks, your relationships? Again, it doesn't always have to be money. It could literally be a lot of networks and connections, because part of changing the bias is changing the kind of water that people are in. So if we're able to make sure that we're really creating this much more multiracial, multi-ethnic sort of network-ish that's happening, then I think it will reduce a little bit of that halo of, I don't want to give to that all Latino organization, right? Because now they're really part of this larger multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition or network. So I think we just have to do a little bit better in that.
Yeah, and I'll actually just add one more thing that the Trust has invested in over the last year and a half, and which is part of the work that I lead, which is to intentionally amplify our partners' work through media. So we have hired a PR firm, and we introduce our amazing PR firm partners to they're called West. They're amazing based in DC, awesome partners. We introduced them to our incredible partners around the country, and they help make those connections with media and journalists to get partners' voices out into the field. And our goal has been, and I'm really proud of the work that we've done around this, to make sure that it's majority people of color, folks out in the world in media, because as bias works in all areas, so often when I read coverage of early childhood, it's some of the same people who are amazing, but if you're a leader in an organization, you're more likely to be white. So how do we counterbalance that? How do we make sure that the voices who are out there in the world talking about early childhood are actually reflective of the communities that are experiencing all of the challenges and leading all of the solutions? There's Nick in the chat saying thanks for the shout out. Yeah, anybody wants to talk about that, it's been a really interesting year and a half. So Iheoma and I have to start getting on the road, and it's raining. So we're actually going to start wrapping up now. And I just want to ask, first, Iheoma, I'm going to ask everybody for like a little response in the chat. But before we do that, any other just thoughts, questions, ideas that you want to share?
I would just briefly share that I thank all the philanthropists and all the fund givers just for the work you've been doing to sort of address the workforce issues of anti-bias, anti-racist. And I'm just want us to continue to push forward, even in the headwinds of all the CRT, blah, blah, blah. So continue to be courageous and bold in your giving, challenge yourself, your organization, to continue to really repair the damage that has been done and has not been fully sort of addressed. So just thank you really for the work, and really I'm here to support you, and obviously vice versa here. So Ellen, thank you as usual for all the work and the guidance and the work that you do, and the Trust for Learning whole team. I think you all are setting the stage of how we do ABAR in philanthropy, and of course Liz Pongella and Brady Education Foundation. So there's a lot that people who are doing this, and we need to lean in on their lessons like you all. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just going to share our emails in the chat just to make sure people have them in case they have more follow-up questions. Thanks so much to everybody. And what we were going to ask you before you sign off, Iheoma, you're being recruited for President 2024. Literally, I would love to work on that campaign. So just say the word, we're all behind you. Hint, hint, So just to close out, it is the time of year for goal setting, intention setting, resolution setting. Thinking toward 2023 and beyond, if folks out in the chat want to just share an intention or a resolution to deepen and continue and push ourselves on anti-racist and racial equity work, would love to hear that. I can just share, certainly for myself, but also at the Trust, one area where we know we need to do a lot more is on language accessibility to a lot of our resources. And in some ways, that's sort of like an easy thing to do, but we haven't done it. So we are pushing ourselves to get more things translated into Spanish. That's just one piece of thinking about a more holistic inclusion and racial equity strategy. Yeah, so if anybody wants to share anything else in the chat in terms of what they're going to do next year, pushing themselves, pushing kind of ourselves collectively, please do. And otherwise, yeah, I think we'll just hang on for a second to see if there are any other comments in the chat. But Iheoma, I cherish your wisdom and just appreciate you so much. I really am inspired and grateful to you.
The same here. And I wish everybody a healthy, restful holiday break and Happy New Year, because I know all of us need it for sure, including me.
Yes, I'm seeing lots of allies and friends' names in the chat, and it's great to see everybody. And yeah, thank you for a few folks who've shared, and let's set those resolutions and also get some rest over the holidays. And yeah, all right.
Right.
Thank you, Iheoma.
Thank you. All right.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye-bye.